Section E, Supervised Visitation and Safe Exchange Services. So if JFF-funded staff provided services to families, or if grant funds were used to support families, support services to families during the current reporting period, check yes, and then answer questions 50 through 61 in Section E. And if you did not use JFF funds to support supervised visitation and safe exchange services or activities, check no and skip on to Section F. But let's say you did use JFF funds for these supervised visitation and safe exchange services. Before I jump into the section and go through the questions, I first want to talk about how to determine if a family is to be reported in this section at all. So first, the family has to request or accept services before you would report them in this section. It is important to remember that if a family does not request or accept services, they should not be reported in this section. Next, you are only going to report on the grant-funded services you provide, not services you provide with other funding. So, do not report a family who only asks for services that are not grant-funded. If your program provides a family with a mix of grant-funded and non-grant-funded services, do not report on your program's ability to provide the non-grant-funded services. You should only report on the ability of your program to provide grant-funded services. And that's because this form is really focused on what grant funds were able to support. And then finally, if you receive a call or a request for service from a family where there is no sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, or child sexual abuse, this activity should not be reported on this form. So do not count or report families who do not meet grant eligibility or statutory requirements. Just don't capture that information on this form. But what you could do is use the narrative sections to talk about how this funding allowed you to provide a holistic approach to services for families. That would be okay in the narrative. But in these quantitative boxes, only report on grant-funded activities. So, a family would not be reported in this section if they are seeking only non-JFF funded services, if they did not accept any of the grant-funded services that were offered or recommended, if they do not have situations involving domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or child sexual abuse, and if they are not the parents or guardians of the child or children. So that leads us into question 50 here on the form. And in question 50, you report the number of families served, partially served, and families seeking grant-funded services who were not served. And so when determining if a family has been served, partially served, or not served, you would report a family as served if they requested grant-funded services and your program was able to provide all of those grant-funded services. You would report a family as partially served if they requested grant-funded services, but your program could not provide all of the grant-funded services requested. So partially served also includes families that begin services, but then one parent chooses not to continue services, so therefore you are not able to provide all of the grant-funded services requested. You would report a family as not served if they requested grant-funded services, but your program could not provide any of those services. Not served includes families for which you complete an intake and/or orientation for one or both parents, but one parent chooses not to begin services. That moves us on to the next question, question 51, which is the number of new families served and partially served during the current reporting period. So in this question, you would report the number of families who have not been reported previously in a JFF progress report. So if this is your first time reporting JFF-funded supervised visitation or exchange services, you should report all families served and partially served as new in question 51. The next question is question 52A, the number of families who were partially served solely due to one parent choosing not to continue services. So of the families that were reported as partially served in question 50B, you report those families that began services but were partially served solely due to one parent choosing not to continue services. The total families here should not exceed the total reported in question 50B. And that's very similar to question 52B, where you report the number of families in which one or both parents completed an intake and or orientation, but ultimately were not served solely due to one parent choosing not to begin services. So of the families that were reported in question 50C, report those families in which one or both parents completed intake and or orientation, but ultimately were not served solely due to one parent choosing not to begin services. The total reported here should not exceed the total reported in 50C. And then in 52C, that is where you capture the other reasons families seeking services were not served or were partially served. So in this question, you would go ahead and check all that apply, and you would indicate whether the reason applies to families who were partially served, families who are not served, or both. Families not served or partially served that you already reported in questions 52A or 52B should not be reported here in 52C. If you check the reasons of, the reason of parties not accepted into program, which is right here, then you must report the reasons the parties were not accepted into the program in question 53. So in question 53, again, you report the number of families not accepted into the program and the reasons why. And so report the total number of families that were not accepted during the current reporting period by indicating the reason that they were not accepted. And this only includes families who requested grant-funded services and were willing to partake in such services, but your program did not accept. I also want to point out the other boxes in both of these questions. So please use the other category for either of these questions sparingly, and if you do need to use them, be as specific as possible. For the most part, the reasons that families were not able to be served or were partially served should be able to be captured in the existing answers, but if for some reason your reason does not fit, you can use the other, but just please be as specific as possible. That brings us on to question number 54. So question number 54 is the demographics of those families that you reported as served and partially served in question 50. And so here you indicate the demographic information for the custodial parents, the non-custodial parents, and the children. and this is broken up into different categories. Ethnicity. So in ethnicity, the parents' ethnicity totals should equal the total number of families served and partially served in question 50. So, however, the number of children does not need to equal the number of families served or partially served in question 50. In the race categories, since you can report more than one race for an individual, the totals for all of these can exceed the total number of people served and or partially served, and by that I mean that the total number of parents, both custodial and non-custodial, can be greater than the total number of families reported as served and partially served. Gender and age are similar to ethnicity, where the totals must equal, for the custodial parents, the totals must equal the number of families served and partially served, since you can only provide one gender or one age for an individual. And then moving down to the next section, there are the other demographic information, And so here you would report numbers of people only to the extent to which you have learned this information incidentally through providing services. So do not include questions about a person's disability or immigration status on any forms used to serve families as a means for collecting this information. This information is not required. It's just if you happen to know it, it would be great for us to collect it. Moving down to question 55. So question 55 is where you report the number of families by primary victimization and the referral source. So for this question, you should report only families who were counted as served and partially served in question 50. So count each family under one referral source in this first, indicated by this first column, and then one primary type of victimization. If a family reports multiple victimization issues, you will be able to report these additional issues in the next question, in question 56. However, in 55, we want an unduplicated count, so only include a family in one of those victimizations. And use your best judgment to determine the primary victimization and referral source. If a family is referred by a private attorney, you would report this as a self-referral. So to kind of explain this chart more, I have an example to verbally walk through with you. And so say you serve 7 families during the current reporting period, 5 of which were referred for domestic violence or dating violence, and 2 were referred for child abuse, child sexual abuse, through the protection order system. What you would do then is go down to the referral source of protection order and report that there were 7 families referred to you through this source. And then in the victimization column, you would indicate the victimization. So we have 5 families referred for domestic violence or dating violence, and then 2 for child sexual abuse. The final column here, it automatically calculates the total based on the numbers that you put in columns 3 through 6, so the victimization columns. The total box at the bottom right, of the table must be equal to the number of families served and partially served. So we want a referral source and victimization for each family that you are providing JFF-funded services to. The next question, question 56, is where you report the family issues. So you want to report all of the issues identified for each family, including the victimization and other programs or challenges. So the column called total number of families should equal the sum of question 50A and B, so the number of families served and partially served, and should be identical to the numbers in the total number of families column reported in question 55. So the 7 should be the same as this total number of families here in question 56. It's not the same on my sample GMS because I didn't walk through and put those numbers in, but when you're walking through this process, you would want to make sure that those equal the same. Multiple victimizations and problems may be reported for each family in this question. So just the total number of families needs to equal the total number of families served and partially served. So that one is an unduplicated count, but then you can report a family in each issue that they have. Then the next question, question 57, is where you report the services provided with JFF program funds. So you report the number of families receiving each of these services and the number of times the services were provided during the current reporting period. The number of families column is asking for an unduplicated count of families receiving that service during the current reporting period. And then the number of times services was provided is a count for each time a service was provided. So that column is not an unduplicated count. Question 58, visits terminated. Here you would report each supervised visitation that was terminated for any reason, and then report the total number of visits terminated during the current reporting period. Question number 59, safety and security problems. Here you report the number of safety and security problems, and that includes the number of parental abduction cases that occurred during supervised visitation and or supervised exchange funded under the JFF grant during the current reporting period. Then question 60, services terminated or completed. Here you report the number of families whose services were terminated or completed during the current reporting period. You would report the family by the primary reason, and we ask that you please be as specific as possible if you use the other category in this question. And then the last question in this section is question 61, which is an optional additional information question where you could discuss the effectiveness of services funded or supported by your JFF program grant and to provide any additional information you would like to share about services beyond what you provided in the data above. Section S, victim services, legal services. So you would complete this section if JFF program-funded staff provided victim services or legal services, or if grant funds were used to support victim services or legal services during the current reporting period. So you should report all grant-funded victim services provided, whether by legal services, a victim service agency, or by staff providing victim services within law enforcement, prosecution, or the court system. So Section F is broken down into two sections, the victim services section and then the legal services section. So if you are providing legal assistance, you will still need to report victims and demographic information in the victim services section in questions 62 through 67 as appropriate. Just a quick note, you would also fill out question 68 as well, which is victim services, if the victims received other victim services that were not legal assistance, as long as those services were funded with JFF program funds. You will then need to fill out the legal services subsection, but only with information related to the victims and survivors who received those specific JFF-funded legal services. So let's jump into the victim services section, and just a few quick notes to give you some background. Most of the data requested in the victim services section is congressionally mandated. So Congress wants to know how many of the number of victims or survivors seeking services were served and how many could not be served. This section is structured to collect data in accordance with the congressional mandate. So please provide information in this section that represents only those victims and survivors served and services provided with JFF program funding. So that's a common theme throughout the form, right? Only provide information about activities that were supported or funded with JFF program funding. Please review this section carefully, as some questions in this section can be and seem counterintuitive. So please remember that you can always contact the VOW-MEI team if you have any questions regarding how to report data on the form in any fashion. We are happy to help you and answer any questions you have. Also, remember that there is a separate set of instructions that can be a resource for you and provide examples, and that's available for download from our website. So first, let's talk about how to determine if a victim is to be reported at all in this section. First, the victim or survivor has to request or accept services before you would report them in this section. It is important to remember that if a victim or survivor does not request or accept services once offered, they should not be reported in this section. Next, you should think about, are the services they are requesting funded under your JFF grant? So two things to consider. You are only going to report on the grant-funded services you provide, not services you provide with other funding, and you will only report on the grant-funded services requested by the victim. So do not report a victim who only asks for services that are not grant-funded. If your program provides a victim or survivor with a mix of grant-funded and non-grant-funded services, do not report on your program's ability to provide the non-grant-funded services. You should only report on the ability of your program to provide grant-funded services. And then finally, the victim survivor must be a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or child sexual abuse to be served using grant funds and to be reported on this form at all. So another way to look at it would be a victim survivor would not be reported in this section if the victim survivor is seeking only services that are not funded with your JFF program grant. If the victim survivor did not accept any of the grant-funded services that were offered or recommended, and if the victim or survivor is not a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or child sexual abuse. So, if you do have a victim survivor that is a primary victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, child sexual abuse, and they are seeking grant-funded services, you would capture information about them in question number 62. And question 62, the number of victim survivors served, partially served, and those seeking services who are not served is really the gateway to the rest of the victim services section as well as the legal services section. So this question is really important. So when determining if a victim survivor has been served, partially served, or not served, you would report a victim as served if they requested grant-funded services and your program was able to provide all of those services. You would report a victim as partially served if they requested grant-funded services, but because of programmatic issues such as those listed in question 65, which we will get to soon, your program could not provide all of these services requested. And you would report a victim not served if your program could not provide any of the grant-funded services the victim requested due to programmatic issues such as those listed in question 65. Before we move on, I want to take a moment to talk about the partially served and not served victim survivors. We often find that grantees are worried about reporting victims as partially served or not served because they fear it will appear that they are not meeting their goals and objectives, or it will shed a negative light on their program. However, by reporting victims as partially served or not served, grantees are helping OVW and decision policymakers understand the scope and burden of violence that stretches far beyond what VAWA is able to fund. OVW knows that VAWA funding is not enough to support every victim who requests services from grantees. Therefore, we want to encourage you all to carefully track and report using both the quantitative data and the narrative data to highlight instances of partial or non-service. Narrative data can highlight long waiting lists for services or a program's inability to support victims on family court days. Your more detailed data can help show the great need for services that exist. So going back and thinking about how to report in question 62. So here, you may only count the victim once during each reporting period in question 62. So we're asking for an unduplicated count. If an individual victim requests services more than once during the current reporting period, they would only be counted once in this question, even if served multiple times. You are counting people in question 62 and not services provided. You can report victim survivors in each reporting period they request services. So for example, in the previous reporting period, a victim requested civil legal advocacy. Your program provided that service and continues providing that service in the current reporting period. You would count this victim in both the previous reporting period progress report and in the current reporting period progress report. And then you also need to determine the type of victimization to report them as. You will need to determine if a victim should be counted as a victim of sexual assault, domestic or dating violence, stalking, or child sexual abuse. Since you may only count a victim once during each reporting period, even if a victim experienced more than one type of victimization, you must determine the most appropriate category in which to report the victim. And this is really to your discretion. You could think of this as reporting it as the victimization that brought them directly to you to receive services, even if they have other victimizations, if they have experienced other victimizations. So it's really up to you to determine the most appropriate category. And if you need any help trying to figure out the best way forward, feel free to give us a call, and we'd be happy to talk to you. So I'm going to jump ahead and go to question 65, the one that I was just referring to not long ago, where the reasons for partial service or non-service is reported. And I'm jumping here because I think thinking about the reasons for partial service and non-service, I think thinking about those reasons helps people understand how to report in question 62. So we will go back through those other questions that we just skipped momentarily, but for now, we're going to look at the reasons that victim survivors seeking services were not served or were partially served. So in this question, you would indicate the reasons victim survivors were partially served, not served, or both. And you check all that apply. And we ask that you use the other category sparingly. So the use of other almost always indicates that a victim survivor should have been reclassified or should not have been counted at all in this section or on the form. So I have a few common things that are reported in other and why they should not be reported in other. And so the first one is victims did not return. If your program began to provide a victim with grant-funded services, the services they requested, and the victim does not return, the victim withdraws, or the victim relocates, you would count this person as served even if the service was not completed. If the program did not take any action to remove them and the victim removed themselves, they are counted as served, because that is essentially that victim no longer requesting the service, and therefore you were able to fully provide them with the services that they were requesting. The next common one is victim refused services. So say if your program offers services, usually through outreach, and the victim refuses services or does not contact you to accept services, you would not count them in this section. Only if, because of outreach activities, they request or accept a grant-funded service would they be counted in this section. For instance, if you call the victim and told them about all of the services that your program provides and they decline services, you would not count this person at all in this section. However, if you called and the victim requested and then received counseling because of your call, you would then count them as served in the victim services section. The next common thing reported in other is service was not provided by our program. So you should only factor in services supported with grant funds for the purposes of this reporting form. So for example, say your JFF grant funds only support crisis intervention services, and a victim contacts your program seeking crisis intervention and a support group, you should only consider your program's ability to provide the crisis intervention when determining if the victim should be counted as served, partially served, or not served. The last common reporting error in other that I have up there is could not locate victim. If your program began to provide the requested services, this person would be counted as served. However, if this person was placed on a wait list, and then when your program was able to provide the service, and then you were not able to locate the victim, you would count this victim as not served. So, and then most likely you would then indicate in question 65 the reason of program reach capacity, because your program was not able to provide a service when it was requested, and it was a programmatic issue. It was the waiting list that did not allow you to provide that grant-funded service when it was requested. And again, please reach out if you have any questions about how to report victims and survivors as served, partially served, or not served. This seems counterintuitive and can get a little funky when you're only thinking about services that are funded with JFF funds, especially since it's a whole host of funding that you use to serve these victim survivors. So please feel free to reach out. I have a few examples that I'd like to look at with you to try to help you think about how to report in question 62. And my first example is, say your JFF grant funds civil legal advocacy and pro se clinics or group services. A victim of domestic violence requests both of these services. You provide civil legal advocacy, but do not provide group services because all groups are full. So in this case, the victim received only some of the services they requested and that you are funded to provide under your JFF grant. The victim should then be reported as partially served under the domestic violence, dating violence column in question 62. And then in question 65, you would check off the reason of program reach capacity in the partially served column. My next example, example number 2, say a survivor of sexual assault requested court accompaniment at the beginning of the reporting period, and then the same survivor came back at the end of the reporting period and requested victim advocacy. And then you are able to provide both of these grant-funded services. In this case, the survivor would be reported as served in the sexual assault column. Additionally, although this person requested services at 2 different times for 2 different services, you should still count them only once in question 62, as question 62 is requesting an unduplicated count of people served, partially served, and not served. My next example, number 3, say your JFF program funds civil legal advocacy and child care. A victim of stalking requests these 2 grant-funded services, and you are able to provide either, and you are unable to provide either because your program is filled to capacity. You would then report this victim as not served in question 62 in the stalking column because you are not able to provide either grant-funded service. You would then also check off the reason of program reach capacity in question 65 in the not served column to indicate the reason. And I have one more example. Example number 4. Say your JFF program funds support pro se clinics and group services. A survivor of sexual assault comes to your office and requests transportation and legal accompaniment, which you are able to provide through other funding. Since the survivor only requested services you are not funded to provide, you would not report the individual on this form. Even though you provided the services requested, they were not provided with grant funds and should not be included on this report. So that's question 62 and 65. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the other questions that we skipped over. And again, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. So in question number 63, the number of new victim survivors served or partially served during the current reporting period. In this question, you would report the number of victim survivors who began receiving JFF program-funded services during the current reporting period. If this is your first time using JFF program funds to provide victim services, then all victim survivors in question 62A and 62B should be reported as new in question 63. If the victim survivor has been counted as served or partially served in a previous reporting period, do not include them here, even if the victim survivor sought services for a new victimization. So, for example, if you provided services to a victim of domestic violence during the previous reporting period, and that victim returned during the current reporting period after being sexually assaulted, you would not report them in this question. The next question, question 64, number of victim survivors served for all types of victimizations. So here, you should report any additional types of victimizations for which a victim survivor received JFF program-funded services during the current reporting period. You report in the row that corresponds to the victimization you reported that victim in question 62A and 62B. Report the victim survivor only once under each category. And then an additional note is that because of VAWA 2013, JFF grantees are allowed to provide services for trafficking victims as long as those victims or survivors are also receiving JFF-funded services for the victimizations of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, or child sexual abuse. So just one more time, you would report a victim in the row that corresponds to the victimization you reported that victim in question 62A and B. So from our previous example, we had one fully served sexual assault victim. So we would expect the presenting victim survivors of sexual assault to that one sexual assault victim to be counted at least once, and that would be in the sexual assault column in the sexual assault row. But say that individual also was served for the victimization of domestic violence, since you reported them as a sexual assault survivor in question 62, then in this presenting sexual assault victimization row, you would also count them in the domestic violence column in that row. We expect that these total victimizations should at least equal, they can be greater than, but they should at least equal the total number of victim survivors reported as served and partially served under that victimization in question 62A and B. Moving on to the next question, and we went over question 65 previously. So the next one is demographic information. So in this question is where you report on the demographics of the victim survivors that were reported in question 62A and B as served and partially served. So if you're noticing, I keep referencing that first question, question 62, because it really does feed into this entire section as well as the legal services section. So getting back, under the race category here, the total number should equal or be higher than the sum of question 62A and B, served plus partially served, since victim survivors may be reported under multiple race categories. And then for ethnicity, gender, and age, all of those totals should exactly equal the sum of 62A and B. And then on the next page, we have some other demographic information. And for these other demographics, report this section to the best of your ability. The numbers reported here are only to the extent that you have learned of them incidentally through providing services. So this information is not required. It's just if you happen to know it, it would be great for you to provide it. The next question, question 67, victim survivors' relationships to offender by victimization. So here, you report the victim survivors' relationship to offenders by type of victimization. And if a victim survivor experienced more than one type of victimization and or was victimized by more than one perpetrator, You would count the victim survivor in all the categories that apply. The total reported under each type of victimization should equal or be higher than the total of 62A and B under the same victimization. For example, if you reported 50 sexual assault victim survivors as served and partially served in question 62, then there should be at least 50 relationships reported in this question under sexual assault. If you do not know the victim survivor's relationship to offenders, you may use the relationship unknown category. As much as possible, report the information in these questions, but information gathering should not be a barrier to service provision. The next question, question 68, is victim services. And based on the victim survivors reported in question 62A and B, you need to report the number of victim survivors who received JFF program-funded services during the current reporting period. You count each victim survivor only once for each type of service that the victim survivor received during the current reporting period in the column under number of victim survivors served, so this column. And then you may count them in each reporting period that they received services. And then report the number of times each grant-funded service was provided in the next column. There. If the only service provided was an intake, and this victim should not be counted at all because it is unlikely the victim requested an intake. The intake is a procedure used by the agency, not a service which a victim requests. If you use the other category, please be very specific and do not use acronyms. However, if you do use acronyms, please spell out what they mean for us. And then the next question, and the final question before we move on to the legal services section, is question 69, protection orders. So here you report the total number of requests received by the authority with power to grant a protection order for temporary and final protection orders, and the total number of each granted by the type of victimization. Okay, so moving right on to the next section, which is the legal services section. And in this, you would only answer questions 70 through 73. So you would only answer questions to the legal services section if your JFF program funds supported an attorney and or paralegal who provided legal services to victim survivors during the current reporting period. And then at the end of this, the next question, question 74, is an optional additional information question where you can discuss the effectiveness of victim services and or legal services. But going through the legal services section, question 70, legal issues. In this question, you report the total number of legal issues addressed by JFF program-funded attorneys or paralegals during the current reporting period. And you count a victim survivor once in each category of legal issue, so A through K, I believe, A through K. Yep, A through K, for which they received assistance. I should note for category B, family law matters, and G, these two are slightly different than the rest. So here you provide an unduplicated count of victim survivors who received assistance in one or more of these subcategories. So I'll walk through an example of how to report in these specific categories in a moment. But for now, we will move on to the next question. And I believe the next question, question 71, is the number of victim survivors who received assistance with legal issues that you reported in question 70. So you would report an unduplicated count of victim survivors who received assistance with at least one legal issue in question 70. If they received assistance with more than one legal issue, you would then go ahead and count them only once in this question, but also report them below in question 72. So question 72 is the number of victim survivors who received assistance with multiple legal issues. And here you report the number of victim survivors who received JSF program-funded services in more than one of the categories, so A through K, which are listed in question 70 during the current reporting period. For purposes of this question, question 72, you should consider all family law matters, which is the section B, as one category, and all immigration matters, section G, as one category. So again, for an individual to be counted in question 72, they would have been counted in one of these general categories, so A, B, C, D, all the way through K. But for specifically B and G, you would only count them once if they received assistance with any of these issues. So if you have an individual who you provided assistance with a divorce and custody/visitation, and those were the only two legal issues you provided them assistance with using JSF program funds, they would only be counted once in this general category B, and since they're only counted once, you would not count them in question 72. And if that was a little unclear for you, please feel free to call us or check the separate instructions. Question 73 is used to report legal outcomes for cases that were closed or for specific issues or matters that were resolved during the current reporting period. So report here only on the outcomes of cases in which services were provided by JSF-funded attorneys or paralegals. You would not report in this question, for example, if a legal advocate assisted a victim with filling out the paperwork for an ex parte protection order. However, if an attorney or paralegal working under the supervision of an attorney provided similar assistance, you would count that here. Report only the highest level of service or outcome achieved for each issue, and report the outcomes of all issues. And then again, the next question is 74, and this is the optional additional information question for the victim services and legal services section. But for now, I'm going to bring us up back to the beginning of the legal services section and go through a couple examples of how to report here with you to get you thinking. So say during the current reporting period, 2 victims of domestic violence requested assistance with divorcing their abusive spouses. In one case, your JFF-funded attorney filed a divorce complaint with no other issues, and in the other case, the attorney filed a divorce complaint and also obtained temporary family court orders addressing custody, visitation, and child support. So in this case, you would report 2 in the general category of B, family law matters, and then because there were 2 individuals that received assistance with these matters, and then in the subcategories, you would report 2 in divorce, since they both received assistance with divorce, and then 1 in custody visitation, and then 1 in child spousal support. So again, I just want to highlight that the general category B of Family Law Matters and the general category G of Immigration Matters is not intended to be a total of the subcategories. It's intended to be an unduplicated count of the people that received assistance with any of those subcategories. Okay. Moving on to the next example, example number 2. Say you provide information and advice to assist someone with obtaining an emergency protection order on their own behalf. Later, you represent that victim at a contested court hearing in which they obtain a final court order. In this case, you would report this victim once in the protection order category in question 70, so up here in row A. And then in question 73, you would report in both information, referral, and advice only, and in court decision. The reason is that the temporary order and the final order each have independent legal outcomes, and they are not always joined together. So you can report on the individual outcomes in question 73, but then in question 70, only report them once in the protection orders column. So you can also think about it as question 70, legal issues, is more concerned about the number of people or victim survivors you provided assistance with. So it's focused on the person, getting a number on the victim survivors that you helped. And then question 73, legal outcomes, is where you can capture information about all of the different issues that you helped them with, and the outcomes, the different outcomes of those issues. So that is it for the legal services section, and that brings us on to section G, narrative, which is the last section of the form. And there are a few questions here that you will need to answer. Question 75. So this question, all grantees are required to answer this question. And here you report on the status of all of your JFF program grant goals and objectives as of the end of the current reporting period. You report only on the status of your approved goals and objectives. All of these must be reported in each reporting period. Your OVW program manager will pay close attention to this question. This question enables them to monitor the status of your goals and objectives. So you should indicate whether the activities are related to your objectives. You should indicate whether those activities for the current reporting period have been completed, are in progress, are delayed, or have been revised. And there is a space for you to do so up here, where you report on the status. Then the next question, the next two questions, 76 and 77, these two always must be answered during the January to June reporting period. So for the report that's due July 30th, questions 76 and 77 must be answered. Question 76 is, what do you see as the most significant areas of remaining need with regard to improving services to victim survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and child sexual abuse, increasing victim survivor safety, and enhancing community response, including offender accountability for both batterers and sex offenders? Here you should report not only on the needs of your program, but the needs within the community, the needs of victim survivors, of underserved populations, any challenges and barriers that you or they experience. In question 77, this question is asking, what has the JFF program funding allowed you to do that you could not do prior to receiving this funding? Be as specific as possible. If you have any information about what it was like before receiving JFF program funding that you can compare with results that occurred after receiving JFF funding, we would really like to know about it. We can use your stories and statistics that you provide when we write our reports to OVW. And then questions 78 and 79 are always optional. For question 78, this is a space for you to provide any additional information regarding the effectiveness of your grant-funded program. And then question 79 is where you can provide any additional information that you would like us to know about the data that you submitted. If there were any issues or irregularities in the data you reported in previous sections of the form, please provide explanations that will help us understand the data that you reported. Report that information here in question 79. So for example, if your computer crashed and you lost data, or if a person that you hired left during the current reporting period so you could not provide certain data, let us know that here. We here at VAWA MEI look at this question before we look at any other part of the report. So this is a great way for you to provide us with direct information. Also, I just want to note that the JFF form has been known to be a little finicky, and so if you're experiencing issues with trying to get the form to validate, or you had to do something in order to get the form to validate, but you had to report inaccurate data because of that, you can go ahead and report the data that you meant to report in this question, and we will go ahead and correct the data once we receive it. So question 79 can definitely be a great resource for you. So once you have finished filling everything out, then it is time to validate your form. And what you will need to do is go all the way to the end of the form. And at the very bottom, I'm going to get there, I promise. Oh, it's not here. Well, there should be a validate button on the very last page of your form, and it will look similar to the validate button that is on the PowerPoint slide. So once you complete the form, you would go to the last page, click the validation button, and the validation process will highlight any missing information or incomplete information and ask whether you wish to return to the section to review or change the data. When this happens, you may see one of two warning messages. So one type of message is the one here with this red X. And if you receive this type of message, it means you're missing some of the required information. To fix this error, you would click yes, and it will bring you back to that exact question on the form. If you don't wish to fix this error at that time, click no, and you can continue on with the validation process. However, it's important to know that you will not be able to complete the validation process until you fix a validation error. So a validation error being one of those errors with the red X. The second type of warning that you may receive is one with this yellow exclamation point. So this type of message indicates that something on the form looks like it may be incorrect. You do not have to make a correction to the form to successfully validate when you get this message. If you want to review the field that the message is speaking to, click yes, and it will bring you back to that exact question on the form. If not, click no, and then you can continue on with the validation process. After correcting or completing missing information, return to the bottom of the form and press validate until all sections of the form are complete. Once all sections of the form are complete, you will receive a third warning message, which is not actually a warning at all, but validation success. So at this point, when you receive that third message, your form has been successfully validated and is ready for you to submit through GMS. So what you want to do is save your form, make sure that the validation is saved once you have successfully done it, and then you go through the process of uploading it into GMS. So that's the form, and that's the reporting process. Here on this slide are some resources available to you through our website. So you can watch this closed captioning recording of the entire progress report training, section by section. You can download training materials or sample progress reporting forms and instructions. We have a frequently asked questions document that could be of use to you that lives there. You can also view any of the reports that we put together. So the summary data reports, which is aggregate data by grant program in charts and tables. Any and all of those resources are available to you there. And I would just like to thank you for accessing our training, and I hope it was of value to you. If you have any questions as you are filling out the reporting form, please feel free to call or email Muskie's VAWA MEI or your program specialist or GMS. All of those contact information are here on the slide for you.